just as some of the things I've shown just briefly with the media stereotype of intelligent design. If you've heard about intelligent design and you've only heard about it from the media, the one thing you know is that it's a faith-based idea. That's what Time magazine said. It's a plot to kill evolution, and it's religiously motivated. It's religion masquerading as science, and the one that really hurt my feelings, it's creationism in a cheap tuxedo. There's been a lot of these kinds of objections lodged against intelligent design, but what I want you to see is that whatever it is, it's not based on religious belief. It's based on evidence that's coming out of the cutting-edge discoveries of modern science, the nanotechnology in cells, the digital code in cells, and the fine-tuning of the laws of physics and chemistry. And as we'll see later tonight, the argument for intelligent design is also based on a standard form of scientific reasoning and testing that is consistent with the scientific method. It's based on inferences about our knowledge of the cause and effect structure of the world. So the basis of intelligent design is not religion, it's scientific evidence and a scientific method, but we do admit that the theory has theistic implications. It is supportive of theistic belief, but if you doubt that it's based on, my claim that it's based on science, ask yourself the question, what caused Anthony Flew, this famous atheist, to change his mind? For him, his embrace of the design hypothesis was not based on religious belief. He had none. He was one of the world's most famous atheists, and he changed his mind, he said, based on the evidence from the miniature world of the cell and the evidence of intelligence and information in DNA. And we'll talk about both those things more tonight. And now I'll hand it over to Mike Behe, who's going to take over the first stage of making the case for intelligent design.
Throughout the second half of the 20th century, spectacular technologies revolutionized scientific understanding of the cell, the basic unit of life. During an interview with biochemist Michael Behe, Strobel learned how this new knowledge has shaken the foundations of Darwin's theory.
In the 19th century, when Darwin was alive, scientists thought that the basis of life, the cell, was some simple glob of protoplasm, like a little piece of jello or something that was not hard to explain at all. But with the hard work of science in the 20th century, we've seen that the cell is far from simple. It's got very complicated molecular machines and things that are very resistant to Darwinian explanation.
Michael Behe has devoted his career to the study of the design and operation of the cell. He has also written extensively on the biochemical challenge to evolution.
Most people have no idea of how small and complex cells are. A typical cell from you or me, called a eukaryotic cell, is probably 1/10 of the size of the head of a pin. And yet, in that single cell, there are about 3 billion units of DNA, making out the chromosomes. And those 3 billion units make the molecular machines of the cell, literally machines that make the cell work.
With computer animation, we can enter the cell. Here, the staggering complexity of its molecular machinery is clearly seen.
It's like going into an automobile factory. The factory has a large number of machines. The parts have to fit together in very specific ways to do their jobs, and if things go wrong, the cell is in big trouble. And just one cell is enormously complex, but humans, you and I, are made from trillions of cells, and those trillions of cells have to fit together in the right way and do their own job. Darwinism was a lot more plausible when we were thinking about globs of protoplasm than it is when we're thinking about molecular machines.
Hi, it's nice to be with you. That looks really fascinating, didn't it? Holy moly. Okay, let me get right into it because I want to keep to the schedule and we've got lots of other folks coming up. So I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes or so on something called answering objections to the argument for intelligent design. And that's on the slide there, if you can see it. Steve talked a little bit about what intelligent design is, but as you may know, not everybody so far has agreed with our argument. And so I'm going to address a couple objections, of the more prominent objections to the idea. But before I start, since intelligent design is such a controversial topic, I want to make clear that in case you were thinking otherwise, I'm not talking officially for my university or for my colleagues. My mother disagrees with me. These are just my ideas here. Okay, so this conversation really got started in earnest 150 years ago when Charles Darwin published his book on the origin of species. And it was really a very good idea and impressed a lot of people at the time and subsequently. And Darwin, like Steve was talking about, said that, well, suppose that an animal were born with a slightly increased coat of fur and it was a cold winter, then that animal would have a better chance of surviving than others of its species which had shorter fur or might be more exposed to the elements. And if it survived and if it produced offspring, then its offspring might inherit the same characteristic. And if the characteristic kept giving an advantage, then over time it would spread throughout the whole population. And it was a very good idea, and it explains many things, and it may explain many things about biology, and continues to do so. But Darwin knew that although his theory could explain some things, there would be things that it'd have trouble with. And in The Origin of Species, he was talking about something called organs of extreme perfection in one section, talking about the eyeball. And at the end of his discussion of those really, really complex organs, he said the following. He wrote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down," adding, "but I can find out no such case." In this passage, Darwin was emphasizing that his theory had to be a gradual one. That is, evolution had to proceed in tiny steps over long periods of time with very incremental improvements. He knew that if animals suddenly improved in great leaps with brand new features all at once, then it would look suspiciously as if something other than random processes were involved. And so he always insisted on this idea of gradualism, very, very tiny and very slow, numerous steps. Well, okay, let's take Darwin at his word and ask, well, what sort of an organ or system could not have been formed, or surely does not look like it could be formed by numerous successive slight modifications? And one such type of system is one which I call irreducibly complex, or has the property of irreducible complexity. Now, irreducible complexity is a fancy phrase, but it has a very, very simple meaning. It just means you've got some system or a machine or something which has a number of different components, and the components interact with each other to perform some function that the individual components themselves can't do. Well, that's a bunch of words. Oftentimes it's easier to grasp a concept if you see an illustration. And an illustration of what I mean by this term is shown on the next slide. And this is a mousetrap. I told you it wasn't hard to grasp. A mousetrap that you could get at a hardware store, anywhere. And it turns out mousetraps have a number of different parts. Here, I'm going to use my mouse to follow along. And it's got this wooden platform here to which everything's attached. And it's also got this tightly wound spring with extended ends to press against the wooden platform here, and another extended end hooking over this other metal part called the hammer. And you've got to push the hammer over, and it's got to be stabilized in position, and that's the job of something called the holding bar. And the end of the holding bar itself has to be stabilized by being inserted into something called the catch. Now, the mousetrap needs all these parts to work. If it were missing the spring, or the hammer, or the platform, or any of the other parts, you would not have a trap that worked half as well as it used to, or a quarter as well as it used to. You would have a broken mousetrap. It would not work at all, like this microphone clipping over my ear. So this is what I mean by the term irreducible complexity. So it turns out that things like this are a big headache for Darwin's theory. Because if you wanted to evolve something like a mousetrap by something like a Darwinian process, numerous successive slight modifications, how would you do it? What would you start with? Would you start with, say, the wooden platform and hope to catch mice inefficiently? No. No, maybe you trip them or something like that. And then maybe you could add another part, maybe the holding bar. And then when they trip, they might impale themselves on the holding bar. Nah, that would be silly, because with irreducibly complex systems, the function only appears when pretty much the whole system's put together. So in the meantime, natural selection can't select for the function of the system. And so it couldn't be produced easily in that gradual fashion that Darwin envisioned. Well, mousetraps are very interesting. I think about them a lot. But what we really want to know is, are there any irreducibly complex biological systems? Or, since, as Steve mentioned, in the past 50 years especially, science has discovered that where the rubber meets the road in biology is at the cellular and at the molecular level. Are there any irreducibly complex cellular or biochemical molecular systems? And the answer is, yeah, they're all over the place. You can't turn a page of a biochemistry textbook without running into such systems. For example, here's the flagellum that Steve talked about. This is a drawing of the flagellum from a biochemistry textbook by Voet and Voet, which is used widely in universities across the United States. And as he said, this is quite literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. This is the part here which acts as the rotor. It's spun around and around and around in a rotary fashion and pushes against the water and therefore pushes the bacterium forward. It's attached to the drive shaft by something called the hook region, which acts as a universal joint, allowing the rotary motion of the drive shaft to be transmitted to the propeller. The drive shaft is attached to a motor which uses a flow of acid from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell to power the turning of it, just like water flowing over a dam powers the turning of a turbine. The drive shaft has to poke up through the bacterial membrane, and so some parts act as bushing material to allow that to occur without leakage. And I know this looks complicated, but let me assure you, this is just a little cartoon view of the bacterial flagellum. This is much more complicated than this illustration appears. For example, just as an example, the parts of the flagellum are not these nice little symmetrical geometric lozenge shapes and discs and so on. These are actually constituted of very complicated molecular entities themselves, proteins, which have to self-assemble and build this rather complex structure from the inside out. Nonetheless, I think this gives you the this is sufficient to get across the idea that, like a mousetrap, the flagellum is irreducibly complex. If it weren't for the hook, or the drive shaft, or the motor, or the propeller, you would not have a flagellum that spun half as fast as it used to, or quarter as fast as it used to. You would have a broken flagellum. Or much more likely, you would have no flagellum, because the cell, it turns out, has sensitive feedback mechanisms to tell it when the construction of this machine is going well or not well, and it will shut off construction if it senses that it's not going well in order to save energy. Now, I'd like to show folks this illustration of the flagellum, because most people, when they look at this, quickly realize that this is a machine. This is not like a machine. It is not analogous to a machine. This is a real machine. And thinking about this might let us kind of figure out how we could explain where it came from. Now, let's see, where am I? Okay. Now, as Steve said, the science in the past 50 years has discovered, much to our surprise, that the cell is based on machinery. It's like if anybody's watched Star Trek and knows about the Borg, who are these kind of half-human, half-machine-like entities. They run on nanotechnology. Well, it turns out we do too. In that sense, we are the Borg. We run on nanomachines. For example, here's an issue of the science journal Cell, a special issue on molecular machines. And if you turn the page and you look at the table of contents of this journal, you find papers with titles such as "The Cell as a Collection of Protein Machines," "Polymerases and the Replosome, Machines Within Machines," "Mechanical Devices of the Spliceosome," "Motors, Clocks, Springs, and Things." So all of life, we now know, is based on these horrendously complex, elegant, sophisticated machines. Now, I wrote a book a while back, as Steve mentioned, arguing that Darwin's theory could not account for this machinery in the cell. It turns out that's not all that controversial. There are a number of scientists, besides myself, who agree that Darwin's theory is not up to explaining such discoveries. People like Stuart Kaufman of the University of Calgary and Lynn Margulis at the University of Massachusetts and so on. And they have their own ideas about what might replace Darwin's theory here. But my difference with them is that I've written that the best explanation for these things is that they were designed, purposely designed by an intelligent agent. And a lot of my critics have said, and I guess I should tell you that I do have some critics. Some of my critics have said, well, that Behe fellow, he's a known Christian. He has been seen entering and leaving churches. And therefore, this idea of intelligent design is a religious idea. It is not a scientific one. And that I'm letting my religious convictions interfere with my scientific work. Well, I appreciate their concern, but I disagree with them. I think the conclusion of intelligent design is completely empirical. And by that I mean that it's based entirely on the physical evidence plus standard reasoning that we use in everyday life. And as an illustration, let me show you the next slide here. This is a Far Side cartoon, if you guys know about it. And here we've got a troop of jungle explorers here, and the lead explorer has been strung up and skewered. And this fellow here turns to this guy here and says, "That's why I never walk in front." Words to live by, let me assure you. Now, everybody here looks at this cartoon, and you immediately realize that this was designed. This was not an accident. His death was intended. Now, how do you know that? Is it a religious conclusion? Oh, probably not. Probably not. No, you know it's designed because you see a number of parts interacting with each other to perform a function. Something like what I mean by irreducible complexity. And it turns out that we perceive design by something called the purposeful arrangement of parts. Whenever we see parts arranged to fulfill some function beyond themselves, we infer design. And that's what we have in spades in biology and molecular machinery these days. Well, okay, that's kind of the Cook's tour of the idea of intelligent design and irreducible complexity. Let's ask ourselves, well, what have other scientists said about these ideas? My book, in which I spell these things out, has been pretty widely reviewed by evolutionary biologists and molecular biologists and other scientists. What have they had to say? Well, they've had a lot of things to say, not all of them kind. Nonetheless, the most common response by most scientists is best summarized by a man named Franklin Harold, who's an emeritus professor of biochemistry from Colorado State. And he published a book a number of years ago, 2001, I think, called The Way of the Cell. And in it, he touched on the idea of intelligent design. And he said the following. He said, "We should reject, as a matter of principle, the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity." And he cites my book. "But we must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical system, only a variety of wishful speculations." Well, that's interesting. Let's pause here for a second. Dr. Harold makes 2 points, and let's look at them in reverse order here. He says that there are no detailed Darwinian accounts, no real Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical system, only a variety of wishful speculations, more colloquially known as just so stories, like the stories written by Rudyard Kipling over 100 years ago, how the tiger got its stripes, how the rhinoceros got its horn, how the bacterium got its flagellum. Well, it's funny, but if you think about it a little longer, it's really astounding that a theory that has the respect of the majority of the scientific community has been so utterly fruitless in explaining the basis of life, and it makes you think that some other theory might be called for. Okay, the second point that Franklin Harold makes is that he says we should reject, as a matter of principle, intelligent design. What principle? What principle is that? If you look at something like the flagellum, that drawing of the flagellum I had up, intelligent design is not something that's hard to see. It pops into your mind right away, but apparently we are forbidden from entertaining the idea of design based on some particular principle. What is it? Well, it turns out he doesn't say. He just writes those lines that I showed you, and then he goes on to other topics in his book. Nonetheless, I think I have a good idea of what he intended by that, and it's shown here on the next slide. If we could have that up for the entrance here. And that is this, that that intelligent design seems to point strongly beyond nature. It seems to have philosophical, maybe even theological implications, and that kind of makes a lot of people nervous. And a lot of people think that science should stay away from theories that have such strong extra-scientific implications. Well, again, I understand that sentiment, but I disagree with it. When I was being trained in graduate school and so on, we were always told that science is supposed to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Let other people worry about philosophical or other implications. And I thought that was a good idea then, and I continue to think so. Okay, now I'm going to turn from a kind of a basic explanation of design to specific objections. And I'm going to look at, if I have time, a legal objection, and then a conceptual objection, and finally a scientific objection, if we can get to all of them. But the first one is legal. As Steve told you, in 1995, there was actually a trial in a federal court in Pennsylvania about whether intelligent design could be mentioned in a schoolroom. And it was held before this man, Judge John Jones, in the Middle District of Pennsylvania. And he ruled very strongly that no, it cannot be, because in his opinion, intelligent design is not science. Intelligent design is religion. What's more, the reasoning for intelligent design is shoddy. And he used his opinion was very strong and very well written. For example, he said the following: "Indeed, the assertion that design of biological systems can be inferred from the purposeful arrangement of parts is based upon an analogy to human design. Because we are able to recognize design of artifacts and objects, according to Professor Behe, that same reasoning can be employed to determine biological design. Professor Behe testified that the strength of the analogy depends upon the degree of similarity entailed in the two propositions. However, if this is the test, ID completely fails." Oh, and I guess I forgot to mention that I was an expert witness at the trial. And I had lawyers in my face about this far for 3 full days. It was great fun, great fun. Kind of like going to the dentist. And Judge Jones was widely hailed for his wisdom and his strong ruling against design. And here's another man. Meet Eric Rothschild. Eric Rothschild was the lead attorney for the plaintiffs in the case, the other guys, not the side I was on. And I didn't know it because I know nothing about law or such things. But it turns out that after a trial is over, each side presents to the judge something called a finding of law and conclusion, or finding of fact and conclusions of law, essentially in which they write what they really hope how the judge will rule, how they see things, and the way they want the judge to see things too. And actually, if you look at the judge's opinion and compare it to Eric Rothschild's written document, you can see echoes of the document in his writing. For example, Judge Jones wrote, "Indeed, the assertion that design of biological systems can be inferred from the purposeful arrangement of parts is based upon an analogy to human design." And Rothschild wrote, tell me if you can see this here. Look. "The assertion that design of biological systems, But this wise judge knew that he should put an indeed right here, and that clearly this preposition should be upon and not on." And he continued, but Judge Jones realized that according to Professor Behe, he should go first in the sentence over here, and because should go third or after that. And here, Judge Jones knew that this should not be a separate paragraph. And this should have a however. And whenever he was writing about expert testimony, not only about me, but about the guys on the other side, the biologists on the other side, and philosophers, academic philosophers. Whenever he was talking about expert testimony, he just copied essentially what he was given. When he talked about the school board and what the newspapers wrote, he used his own language then. With the expert testimony, it was cut and paste. So the point is this, that judges can't rule on the validity of intelligent design. They're certainly welcome to rule on the legality of it, but whether one explanation for the bacterial flagellum is better than another is not in the judicial province. Judge Jones, even though he had to sit through the trial, his background did not prepare him for this. He has a law background, a political background. His previous claim to fame was a stint as the director of the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board. So the point is that you cannot surrender your judgment on these issues to somebody else, even if it's somebody as well regarded as a federal district court judge. Okay, so that was the legal argument. How much time do I have? Ray, another 10 minutes?
We'll stop you. Keep going.
Okay. This is the conceptual argument against design. It was first proposed by Professor John MacDonald at the University of Delaware, and it has to do with the concept of irreducible complexity. Just about the day that my book came out in 1996, people were trying to see how they could build mousetraps by numerous successive slight modifications. That's a good thing to do. That's how you would attack an argument like mine. And for my money, the best one was put out by this fellow, Professor John MacDonald. And he wrote on his website, which is shown up there, he showed this trap, and he said, well, this Behe guy, he said, this is irreducibly complex. It has all these 5 parts. You take one away, it won't work. He says, but I can take away a part, and it'll work. I can take away the catch right here. He says, I took it away, and now I put the holding bar down here, and it's just kind of tucked into the edge of the hammer. And the idea is that if a mouse comes along, this is just precariously balanced. He nibbles the cheese, this will slam shut. If the mouse is unfortunate, maybe his tail will be hanging over here. This will catch the tail. He'll have to drag the trap around behind him. You won't be able to get food as efficiently. You won't be able to attract mates. And it would work. It might be a little less efficient, but it would work. But he continued, not only that, I can take away another part, he said. I can take away the holding bar, and it will still work. He says, look, I took away the holding bar, and now the hammer is shaped so that it's just touching the edge here, and the tension is pushing it down. Again, the idea is the mouse comes along, nibbles here, this goes over the edge, this snaps down and catches a paw or a tail, and the mouse is in trouble. But he said, I can build a trap with 2 parts. I can take away the hammer. Now the spring itself is shaped so that it hangs precariously by the edge here, and the same thing, if the mouse came along and nibbled, it might get trapped. But he said, yes, indeed, I can build a mousetrap with 1 part. And here it is. This is the one end of the mousetrap, precariously balanced on this one, and it's under tension so that if it's released, this will go down, catch a paw or a tail here, and again, the mouse is in trouble. So he's saying that, yes, I showed a mousetrap with 5 parts. He can make one with 1 part. But nonetheless, he says something strange on his website. He says, the reduced complexity mousetraps shown below are intended to point out the logical flaw in the intelligent design argument. They're not intended as an analogy of how evolution works. Well, what does that mean? You know, if they're not intended as an analogy of how evolution works, then what's the point? And what is this logical flaw in the intelligent design argument? Well, it turns out the logical flaw, as he saw it, was that I had pictured a mousetrap with 5 parts. He could make one with fewer, and therefore you can make simpler mousetraps than I had pictured. And my response to that is, no kidding. You know, you can make mousetraps any of a number of ways. My family, sometimes we use glue traps, you know. My kids have a game called Mousetrap with a lot of different parts. As a matter of fact, I had said the same thing in Darwin's Black Box, in the book. I had said we need to distinguish between a physical precursor and a conceptual precursor. The trap described above is not the only system that can immobilize a mouse. On other occasions, my family has used a glue trap. In theory, at least, one could use a box propped open with a stick that could be tripped, or one can simply shoot the mouse with a BB gun. That'll show it. However, these are not physical precursors to the standard mousetrap, since they cannot be transformed step by Darwinian step into a trap with a base, hammer, spring, catch, and holding bar. The point is, we have a trap right here that we're trying to explain. Can we get to that by numerous successive slight modifications? Well, let's ask the question, using John McDonald's intermediates, can we do that? Are they numerous successive slight modifications, precursors to a type of mousetrap that he showed as the full mousetrap? And can you get there by a Darwinian process? Well, we'll go through and show that you can't, but let's look at something else on his website that should give us pause. He said, the first step in reducing the complexity of a mousetrap is to remove the catch. Okay. The hold down bar is then bent a little so that it will catch on the end of the hammer that protrudes out from the spring. This end of the hammer might need a little filing to make the action nice and delicate. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, we've got John McDonald, intelligent agent, re-engineering the trap to make it work. But if you use your intelligence to rearrange things, that is not a Darwinian process. Okay, well, let's look then. Let's start with the simplest mousetrap, as evolution would have to do, and see if we can go from one to the other by a random, numerous successive slight modifications. Here we start out with step 1, the trap here, the one-piece mousetrap. And the first thing to say is that this is the strangest looking spring I've ever seen in my whole life. I have never seen anything like that. What's more, we can tell that it was purposely designed this way in order to act as a mousetrap. If these angles had been a little more oblique or acute, if the length of this thing was bigger or less big, this trap wouldn't work. Well, okay, you got to start somewhere. So let's give him that. But let's say that if intelligence has anything to do with it in any other step, then we don't have anything really relevant to Darwin's theory. And intelligence comes along right away. For example, here we go from 1 to 2. Okay, so we have a two-piece trap now with a spring and a platform. But you'll notice this is not the spring that was here. Okay, this particular arm of it has been bent by 90 degrees, and this part shortened by a considerable length. This arm here has been bent by 180 degrees and shortened considerably. So not only do we have an extra part, but we have had to re-engineer a second part. So this is just a little cartoon to show that we can't go directly from here to here. We have to have somebody engineering things in order to get to the final configuration. But we have to ask ourselves, wait a second, the spring here was in tension on itself. Why doesn't the spring here kind of spring and relax? What's keeping it under tension? It's not hitting against another part of itself again. Well, if you look real close, you'll notice here's a little staple here, and here's another little staple over here. If it weren't for those staples, the trap wouldn't work. They're keeping it under tension. Not only that, notice that the placement of the staples is very important. If this staple was over here, that one over here, it wouldn't work. So we have not gone from a one-piece to a two-piece mousetrap. We've gone from a one-piece to a four-piece mousetrap. which has been re-engineered in the process. So where did those staples come from? Did an angel bring them from heaven? Well, no. Darwinism cannot invoke angels bringing staples for mousetraps because the angels are on our side. Okay, we go from step 3 to step 4. This is the last one I'll show you here. Now we're not only adding a piece, the holding bar here, but we also have to rearrange the hammer here in order to lengthen it and give it a couple more bends and so on. Not only that, notice that the new piece is not just a flat metal bar. It's got this little curl on it, and it's hooked around this staple here. If it wasn't for that little curl, this whole trap would be useless. So not only do we have an extra part, we have re-engineering all along the way. And step 4 to step 5 I leave as an exercise for the audience. So the point is that we'll get to that. The point is that that intelligence saturates the whole series, and that if you can't even go from one simple mousetrap to another simple mousetrap without invoking intelligence, how much more unlikely is it to go from one complex molecular machine to another?